Imagine a city of 100,000 people. Streets laid out in careful order, temples rising above the tree line, marketplaces full of noise and color, a drainage system more advanced than anything Europe would build for another 1,000 years. Now imagine that city, in less than a single generation, emptying out completely. No invading army marches in. No records describe a plague sweeping through. No single battle, no single fire, no single flood. The people simply leave, house by house, until the streets go quiet and the jungle or the desert begins to take back what was built. This isn't a story that happened once. It happened at least 3 times that we know of, on 3 different continents, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and in every single case we are still piecing together why. Today we're going deep into 3 of history's greatest disappearing acts. The fall of the great Maya cities in Central America. The hidden and only recently discovered cities buried beneath the Amazon rainforest, and the slow, almost silent fade of the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the very first great urban societies on Earth. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened to these 3 civilizations, but why their stories might be one of the most important warnings history has to offer us. So let's start in the jungles of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, with a civilization that built cities to rival ancient Rome's provincial capitals, and then, seemingly overnight, walked away from them. The Maya civilization didn't appear out of nowhere. By the time its great cities reached their peak, somewhere around the 6th to 8th centuries of the Common Era, the Maya had already been developing their culture for well over 1,000 years. They weren't a single unified empire the way we often imagine ancient Egypt or Rome. Instead, the Maya world was a patchwork of independent city-states, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own alliances, its own rivalries, sometimes cooperating, sometimes at war with one another. Not unlike the city-states of ancient Greece. What's remarkable is just how advanced these city-states were. The Maya developed one of the only fully developed writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas, a complex script of hieroglyphs that recorded history, astronomy, and religious ritual. They tracked the movements of Venus with a precision that still impresses astronomers today. They developed the mathematical concept of zero independently, centuries before it reached Europe through other paths. Their calendar systems were so intricate that some of them are still the subject of academic study. Precisely because of how accurately they modeled long cycles of time, cities like Tikal, in what's now northern Guatemala, weren't small ceremonial outposts. Tikal, at its height, may have supported a population upwards of 60 to 90,000 people, with towering stone pyramids, an intricate network of paved causeways connecting different districts, and a sophisticated system of reservoirs designed to capture and store rainwater for the dry season. Calakmul, its great rival to the north, may have been even larger. These were real cities, with real urban planning, real economies, and real political drama playing out between them for centuries. And then, starting around the late 8th century and accelerating through the 9th, something remarkable happened. One by one, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands began to empty. Construction of new monuments stopped. The carved stone stelae that Maya rulers used to record their victories and their reigns simply stopped being made. Population estimates, based on the density of housing remains that archaeologists can date, show staggering declines, in some regions as much as 90%, within the span of just 100 years or so. For context, that's a demographic collapse on the scale that dwarfs most wars and plagues in recorded history. It's important to say clearly, this was not the end of the Maya people. Maya communities persisted, and still persist today, with millions of people of Maya descent living across the region, many still speaking Maya languages. What collapsed was something more specific: the elaborate, densely populated city-state system of the classic period. The kings, the monumental architecture, the intricate political alliances between rival capitals, that particular way of organizing society came apart. So why? For a long time, popular explanations leaned towards single dramatic causes: an invasion, a peasant uprising, a sudden epidemic. But the archaeological and climate evidence that's accumulated over the past few decades points towards something less cinematic and, honestly, more unsettling: a slow-motion, multi-layered breakdown. The first major piece of evidence comes from climate science. Researchers studying sediment cores from lake beds in the Yucatan Peninsula have found chemical signatures indicating a series of severe, Multi-year droughts that struck the region right around the time the great cities were emptying out. These weren't ordinary dry spells. Some of the evidence suggests these were the most severe droughts the region had experienced in thousands of years, hitting a civilization that depended heavily on consistent rainfall to feed intensive agriculture and fill those elaborate reservoir systems the cities had built. But drought alone doesn't fully explain a collapse of this scale, because civilizations survive droughts all the time. What made the Maya particularly vulnerable was the strain they'd already placed on their own environment. Centuries of population growth had pushed Maya agriculture to its limits. Forests were cleared at scale to make room for fields, which likely altered local rainfall patterns and increased soil erosion, compounding the very drought conditions that were already threatening food supplies. In other words, the civilization had already been quietly eroding the foundation it depended on, long before the droughts hit hardest. Layer on top of that a political structure that was, by its nature, fragile. Because the Maya world was never unified under one central authority, there was no single institution capable of coordinating a response to a crisis that crossed city-state boundaries. Instead, as resources grew scarcer, evidence suggests warfare between rival cities intensified. Fortifications appear more frequently in the archaeological record during this period. Trade routes, which cities depended on for everything from salt to obsidian, became disrupted as the political landscape destabilized. So what we're likely looking at isn't one cause, but a chain reaction. Environmental strain from population growth, compounded by a severe and prolonged drought, compounded by political fragmentation and rising conflict between rival states, each factor making the others worse. Until the entire system of city-states that had taken centuries to build came apart within the span of a single long human lifetime. It's not a story of one dramatic ending. It's a story of a complex, interconnected system losing its resilience piece by piece until it could no longer hold itself together. Now let's travel south and east, into a landscape that for most of the 20th century, we assumed had almost no complex human history at all: the Amazon rainforest. For generations, the popular image of the Amazon was of an untouched wilderness, home only to small scattered, nomadic groups living lightly on a landscape too dense and too resource-poor to support anything larger. Even many professional archaeologists held on to some version of this assumption for decades, partly because the deep, permanent canopy of the rainforest makes traditional excavation and survey work incredibly difficult. You can't easily see ruins from the ground when they're buried under generations of jungle growth. But that assumption has been overturned, and overturned dramatically in just the past couple of decades, thanks largely to a technology called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. LiDAR works by firing pulses of laser light down from aircraft flying above the forest canopy. Most of those pulses bounce off leaves and branches, but some slip through gaps in the foliage all the way down to the ground. And by measuring the time it takes for those pulses to return, researchers can build an extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional map of what's actually on the forest floor, invisible to the naked eye and to satellite photography, but fully visible once you strip away the vegetation digitally. What that technology has revealed is staggering. Instead of scattered, isolated settlements, researchers have mapped extensive networks of geometric earthworks, roads and causeways connecting different sites across considerable distances, large central plazas, and evidence of organized, large-scale agriculture. In some regions, what was once assumed to be untouched primary rainforest turns out to be what scientists call an anthropogenic forest, meaning a forest whose very composition, the mix of tree and plant species that exist there today, was shaped by centuries of deliberate human cultivation. The Amazon, in other words, wasn't simply survived in. In many areas, it was actively built and managed on a scale that implies organized societies with real population density, coordinated labor, and long-term planning. This reframes the entire mystery. We're not asking why a handful of small nomadic bands might have moved on. We're asking what happened to societies large and organized enough to construct causeway networks and geometric plazas, comparable in ambition, in some cases, to the earthworks of other early urban civilizations elsewhere in the world. And here the mystery gets even stranger. Because unlike the Maya, we don't even have a fully agreed timeline for when many of these Amazonian societies reached their peak, or precisely how their decline unfolded. What we do have is a chilling and increasingly well-supported theory tied to one of history's most devastating and most invisible Catastrophes. Disease. When European explorers began making contact with the Americas starting in the late 15th century, they carried with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which indigenous populations across the Americas had no prior immunity. What's crucial to understand is that disease often spread far faster than the explorers themselves did. Trade networks, kinship ties, and travel between communities meant that a pathogen introduced on a coastline could move inland along existing social and trade connections, reaching populations who might not encounter an actual European person for decades, if ever, in that generation. This means it's entirely possible, and increasingly supported by evidence, that large, complex Amazonian societies were devastated by epidemic disease before most European explorers had even physically penetrated deep into the rainforest interior. By the time later expeditions and colonizers did arrive and describe what they saw, they may have already been looking at a landscape in the aftermath of catastrophic depopulation, a landscape that appeared sparsely inhabited and wild, not because it had always been that way, but because the societies that had shaped it for centuries had just been devastated. In some regions, losing the overwhelming majority of their population within a generation or two, which means that famous image of the Amazon as pristine, untouched wilderness might actually be something closer to a portrait of survivors' absence, a jungle reclaiming cities and fields whose builders had already been lost. The forest didn't just hide a wilderness from us. In a very real sense, it may have hidden the aftermath of one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history, one that unfolded largely out of sight of written record, leaving us to reconstruct it laser pulse by laser pulse. Centuries later, now let's travel to a third civilization, one that predates both the Maya and the flourishing of Amazonian earthwork societies by thousands of years, and whose story is perhaps the strangest of all three, because instead of a dramatic collapse, what we find looks more like a long, deliberate, quiet withdrawal. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan civilization after one of its major cities, flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, roughly contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, making it one of the very earliest large-scale urban civilizations on the planet. Its great cities, most famously Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, were extraordinary by the standards of their time and honestly, by the standards of many much later civilizations too. These cities featured remarkably standardized urban planning, with wide streets laid out in careful grid patterns, and buildings constructed from uniformly sized fired bricks, suggesting some form of centralized regulation or at least a widely shared building standard across an enormous territory. They developed a system of standardized weights and measures that archaeologists have found consistent across sites separated by hundreds of miles, implying extensive trade networks and a shared economic system spanning a huge geographic area, larger in territorial extent than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia at their respective peaks. Perhaps most remarkable of all was their approach to urban sanitation. Mohenjo-daro featured covered drains running beneath the streets, private household bathrooms connected to that citywide drainage system, and what appears to be one of the most sophisticated urban water management systems anywhere in the ancient world. Sophisticated enough that some elements of it wouldn't be matched again in that region for thousands of years. And yet, for all we know about how these cities were built, there is one enormous, almost eerie gap in our knowledge. We cannot read their writing. The Indus script, found on thousands of small seals and other artifacts, remains undeciphered to this day, despite more than a century of dedicated effort by linguists and archaeologists. This means that this civilization, unlike the Maya with their hieroglyphic historical records, or Egypt with its extensively translated inscriptions, has essentially left us its own explanation of events, written down, sitting in museums and archaeological sites, completely unreadable. Whatever the Indus people wrote about their own cities, their own rulers, their own crises, is right in front of us, and we simply cannot understand a word of it yet. So what does the archaeological and environmental evidence tell us? In the absence of a written record, we can interpret. Starting around 1900 BCE and continuing over the following centuries, the great urban centers of the Indus Valley began a gradual decline. This wasn't a sudden abandonment like what we see in the Maya lowlands centuries later. It was slower, more staggered, playing out over a much longer stretch of time, closer to several centuries than a single generation. The leading theories center heavily on environmental and hydrological change, Many researchers point to shifts in river systems across the region, including the possible drying up or significant reduction of a river system some scholars associate with the ancient Ghaggar-Hakra River, which may have provided crucial water resources to many Indus settlements. Changes in monsoon patterns, potentially becoming less reliable or shifting geographically over time, would have placed enormous strain on agriculture that had come to depend on predictable seasonal rainfall. But what's particularly interesting about the Indus Valley story is that the evidence increasingly points not toward a catastrophic collapse in the way we often imagine such events, with cities violently destroyed or hastily abandoned, but towards something more like a gradual reorganization of society. Rather than one dramatic ending, the archaeological record suggests a shift away from the large, densely populated urban centers towards smaller, more dispersed rural settlements spread out across a wider area. In some ways, it may be more accurate to describe what happened not as the Indus civilization collapsing, but as it transforming, trading the density and administrative complexity of great cities for a more distributed, resilient, if less visually spectacular, way of life better suited to a changing environment. It's a strikingly different pattern from either of the other two civilizations we've discussed. The Maya lowlands saw a relatively rapid demographic collapse concentrated within roughly a century, driven by an interlocking combination of drought, environmental strain, and political fragmentation. The Amazonian societies appear to have suffered a catastrophic, disease-driven population collapse following European contact, erasing evidence of complexity so thoroughly that we're only now, with the help of laser mapping technology, beginning to understand what was lost. And the Indus Valley Civilization seems to have simply, slowly, faded from its urban centers over a period of centuries, dispersing rather than vanishing. Its story locked inside a script we still cannot read. 3 civilizations. 3 different continents. 3 completely different timelines and mechanisms of change. And yet, when you step back and look at all 3 side by side, a pattern starts to emerge. One that goes beyond the specific details of drought or disease or river shifts. In every case, we're looking at a society that had reached a remarkable level of complexity. Complexity in engineering, in urban planning, in trade networks, in political and social organization, and in every case, the very complexity turned out to be a source of fragility, as much as it was a source of strength. Complex systems, whether ancient cities or modern ones, depend on many interlocking parts functioning together. Reliable food production, functioning trade routes, stable political relationships, predictable environmental conditions. When enough of those interlocking parts come under stress at the same time, the very interdependence that made the system so impressive in the first place can turn into a vulnerability, allowing stress in one part of the system to cascade into others. None of these were primitive societies caught off guard by forces they couldn't have understood. These were, by the standards of their respective eras, some of the most technologically and organizationally advanced human societies on the planet. The Maya had mathematics and astronomy that rivaled anything else in the ancient world. The builders of the Amazonian earthworks reshaped an entire ecosystem to their advantage over centuries. The Indus Valley cities had sanitation systems more advanced than what most of the world would use for millennia afterward. Being advanced didn't save any of them from the underlying fragility that complexity can quietly build into a society, especially when environmental conditions shift faster than the society's institutions can adapt. That's really the uncomfortable thread running through all 3 of these stories. It's not that ancient people were somehow less capable or less sophisticated than we are. It's that scale and complexity. The very things we tend to associate with progress and permanence can also be exactly what makes a society vulnerable to disruption when enough pressures converge at once. The story of the Maya, the hidden cities of the Amazon, and the quiet fate of the Indus Valley aren't just fascinating historical mysteries. They're some of the clearest reminders history has to offer that no level of achievement makes a civilization immune to the conditions it depends on, and there's something almost humbling in that. These cities stood for centuries. Their builders solved engineering problems, developed writing systems, tracked the stars, organized labor and trade across enormous distances, and built lives every bit as rich and complicated as our own. And still, when the underlying conditions shifted enough, all of that complexity wasn't enough to hold the system together in its original form. The Maya people endured in smaller communities, carrying their language and culture forward to today. The Amazonian societies left behind earthworks now being rediscovered, testimony to a scale of organization the modern world spent centuries failing to imagine. And somewhere in museum collections around the world, the Indus Valley's own explanation for its own transformation waits, quite literally, to be read. Maybe someday it will be. Until then, we're left piecing together these stories the way archaeologists always have. Sediment core by sediment core. Laser scan by laser scan, broken seal by broken seal. Trying to understand not just what happened to these remarkable societies, but what their stories might still be trying to tell us about the fragile, complicated relationship between human ambition and the world that ambition depends on.